If you grew up in the 2000s, you might have experienced an era where the rules of 3D game design were still loose. Developers were still experimenting with many formulas, and the result was a flood of wonderful, weird, and bad games. It was chaotic, but in the best way possible. But if you grew up in the 2000s, in a country where gaming wasn't exactly affordable or accessible, your experience was probably very different. You most likely didn't buy your games from official stores. You got them from sketchy kiosks or street vendors. Pirated DVDs, modded consoles, and cover arts made with passion. And yet, for many of us, this was gaming. Not the polished corporate version, but the bootleg and cracked version. That was the creative underground scene that made gaming available to many. Nowadays, piracy wears a different mask. It's no longer about getting free games or cheap games. It's all about game preservation now. People argue that without ROM archives, entire generation of games would disappear, and honestly, I agree. Many classics are no longer sold and supported. Your only option are either to hunt down overpriced second-hand copies or download it from in places like Indonesia. Piracy wasn't just common, it was the norm. For years, it was how people got their games. Not because we didn't know it was illegal, we knew. But when the market was so flooded with bootlegs, when every shelf was filled with these bootlegs and pirated DVDs, the line between real and fake blurred. Some of us got confused, others just stopped caring. But to understand this, we need to go back to the very beginning, the dawn of piracy itself. Before modded PS2s and bootleg kiosks became the norm, piracy was already thriving in the shadows of the early computing era. In the late 1970s, as machines like the Apple II and Commodore entered homes, users discovered that you could copy floppy disks, so people began duplicating disks and spread them like cancer. Developers didn't take long to respond. By the early 1980s, they began embedding copy protection. But crackers rose to the challenge, stripping protection and stamping their own intros onto the games, turning piracy into a subculture of technical rebellion. The rebellion evolved into something bigger, the wares. By the 1990s, this scene had expanded globally, laying the groundwork for how piracy would operate in the internet age. From FTP servers to torrents and modding forums. Meanwhile, in the console world, a different kind of disruption was brewing. In 1979, four-star Atari programmers left Atari due to frustration over low pay despite generating massive revenue. Together, these guys formed Activision. Atari sued them with various claims, but basically, Atari was trying to block them from making games for the Atari 2600. But in 1982, the court refused to grant an injunction and the companies settled. This moment was historic. Activision became the first third-party console game developer, breaking Atari's monopoly and opening the floodgates for independent publishing. The consequences were massive. By the end of 1982, the number of Atari games on the market exploded from just under 100 games to over 400 games. The flood of low-quality titles helped trigger the video game market crash of 1983 and set the stage for Nintendo's strict licensing model and lockout chips in the NES. So while floppy disk copying and wares culture sparked the fire in the PC world, the Activision lawsuit poured gasoline on the console side. Together, they laid the foundation for piracy and bootlegging scenes in places like Indonesia. From the ashes of video game crash of 1983 rose a quiet revolution. In Japan, Nintendo had already launched the Famicom in 1983 and it was thriving. When they brought it to North America in 1985 and rebranded the console as the NES, They didn't just sell a console, they sold trust. Nintendo enforced strict licensing and used lockout chips to prevent unauthorized game, and it worked for the time. The NES revived the console market, redefined quality control, and laid the foundation for modern gaming. Nintendo's success with the NES didn't just revive the console market, it created a global demand for affordable gaming. But in many regions, official Nintendo hardware was expensive, hard to find, or simply unavailable. That's where the Famiclones came in. A Famiclone is a clone of the Famicom or the NES, designed to run Nintendo's cartridges but built without Nintendo's approval. Most were manufactured in China and Taiwan, where the engineers reverse engineered the original chips and by the mid-1990s began using NES-on-a-chip designs, or basically a miniaturized NES. These chips were cheap and compact, allowing for more versatility in the production process. In Indonesia, Famiclones were quite common. They were sold in toy stores and electronic markets. They came bundled with pirate multicards labeled 99999 in one, looping the same 20 games with palette swaps or even just name swaps. Some Famiclones mimic the Some Famiclones mimic the Famicom's look, like the Micro Genius or Spica IQ 701. Others shaped like PlayStations, Mega Drives, or even handhelds. Some Famiclones were even built into DVD players, with chip controllers and a disc containing the ROMs. Not only Famiclones, fake cartridges were also sold in the market. Super Nintendo and Sega MD titles were also pirated, often region-free. According to Danny Jidat, retro console collector who grew up in that era, bootleg cartridges were sold for around 50,000 rupiahs, around $30 in the 90s. That was the same price as most original releases. Some bootleg cartridges were so well disguised, visually mimicking original releases. Most buyers couldn't tell the difference. Sellers didn't always clarify, and in many cases, they didn't know either. The result, a market where fake cartridges were sold at premium prices. This pirating scene would then evolve into the disc piracy in the 5th and 6th gen era, the era where I grew up in. The era I grew up with. The era of the Penguin and the PlayStation 2 experience. But before we get into that, let's establish some things first. You might be asking, so are we just going straight into PlayStation 2? Well, kinda. Here's the thing, between PlayStation 1 and the PlayStation 2 pirating scene, there's so little difference. So I decided to group it. Well, what about the Nintendo 64, the Dreamcast, the GameCube, the original Xbox? Throughout my research, I did find a little bit of pirating scene for those consoles. But here's the thing, no disrespect, but the PlayStation beat their asses in terms of popularity. I knew they were around at the time. I've seen them on the internet for sure. But personally, I never knew anyone who ever owned one of these consoles. That means their pirating scene were hardly the norm at all. Anyway, with the shift from cartridges to CDs and DVDs in the PlayStation era, piracy becomes easier and cheaper. CD burners were becoming more accessible, and blank CDRs and DVDRs were sold in bulk. In Indonesia, this meant those shady manufacturers could mass produce pirated discs in a short time. But the PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2 had built-in security system that could prevent piracy. So, how did the pirates bypass them? By default, PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2 couldn't run pirate discs. There were workarounds like disc swapping, but the real solution was modding, either through a mod chip or by installing an exploit on the memory card. These mods didn't just unlock pirated games, they also bypassed region locks, enabled backwards compatibility on certain PS2 models, allowed access to backup via USB, internal HDD, or network storage. Most PS2 sold in Indonesia were already modded. When buying one, you were usually offered two choices. The first one, the disc version, a PS2 with a mod chip that lets you play pirated discs directly, simple and straightforward. And two, the hard drive version filled with preloaded games. Anyway, with the mod chip installed, the floodgates opened. Even your regular DVD vendor probably had a stack of PS2 games tucked under the counter. Now, I'll be talking about pricing, but before we dive into it, it's important to note that I'm comparing everything to the 2011 market price. Yes, I just got my very own PS2 in 2011. Shut up. Remember when I told you that some console cartridges, real or fake, were sold at the same price? Yeah, this time is different. PS2 bootlegs didn't even pretend. It wasn't about looking real, it was about flooding the market. Quantity over quality. Oh, come on, you've seen the pictures. There's no way those were sold for $60. These weren't premium products, they were mass produced crap. Cheap, fast, and everywhere. And honestly, that was the point. Nobody cared if their disc looked like trash, as long as it booted and gave you a few hours of fun. In 2011, I would assume an original PS2 game cost around 300 to 600,000 rupiah, which is around 30 to 60 US dollar. An average Indonesian make only 1.5 to 2 million rupiahs per month. That's up to 40% of an average monthly salary. Meanwhile, pirated disc just 5 to 10,000 rupiahs, less than the price of a meal. For most gamers, the choice wasn't moral, it was mathematical. Piracy was illegal, yes, but on the other side, it gave life to some consoles. Some consoles lasted for a long time because of piracy in small countries. Not only that, it gave us life too. We got to enjoy gaming as a part of our childhood. Revert the USB loading method, who aren't that lucky. When the PS3 hit the scene, it quietly killed off the old piracy formula. Unlike the PS2, the PS3 used BD-ROM. It's high capacity but expensive. Burning a Blu-ray wasn't something you could do with a cheap PC drive, so physical piracy faded and digital methods took over. Most PS3s came with custom firmware or CFWs to unlock their consoles, allowing apps like Multiman to run backup games directly from a hard drive. Similar method of running backup games were also used by the PSP to run games from its memory stick. But there's always a catch. Once modded, the PS3 became risky to take online. Sony could detect unauthorized firmware, and getting banned from PSN meant losing access to multiplayer, updates, and digital purchases. For some gamers, this was a deal breaker. Those who wanted to experience the 7th gen online features had to give up piracy and stick to official releases. Meanwhile, early adopters of PS3 modding paid a heavy price. Not only they were locked out of online play, but they were also stuck on outdated firmware, unable to run newer games that required system updates. This problem, however, was eventually solved. As matured, updated firmware versions and spoofing techniques emerged, allowing modded consoles to go online. The Xbox 360, on the other hand, kept one foot firmly in the physical world. It still used dual-layered DVDs, so pirated discs remain popular. They're more expensive than the PS2 disc, however. The 360 also had digital piracy support at the time, just like the PS2. And while we're at it, we might as well talk about the PC pirating scene. Veteran pirates were already deep into torrent culture, downloading cracked games from the internet. But in Indonesia, piracy wasn't just digital. Local PC game market also sold physical pirated copies, distributed on DVDs or multi-disc sets, similar to Xbox 360 discs. For many PC users without fast internet, They were the only way to play AAA titles. PC game platforms like Steam was accessible, but gamers weren't really aware of them as a video game market platform. Steam was only seen as a launcher for Dota 2, Team Fortress, and CS:GO by most of them. Not only that, there were little options for payment methods for the Steam, and refilling your Steam wallet was more like a chore than a joy. And then there was the Wii. It relied on the homebrew channel, unlocking USB game loading and emulators. With the rise of online console gaming and the risk of getting banned for using jailbroken console, a lot of console gaming vendors started providing unmodded console and original games. As the eighth console generation rolled in, Indonesia's gaming landscape began to shift, quietly but profoundly. The PlayStation 4, unlike its predecessors, didn't immediately fall into the hands of modders and pirates. Jailbreaks, like PS4 Homebrew Enabler, eventually surfaced, but they came late and with strict limitation on its early days. Today, though the modding scene has matured fastly, the main users of jailbroken PS4s are PlayStation rental owners, where physical discs are more of a hassle than a benefit. It's easier just to preload every console with Pro Evolution Soccer, FIFA, and NBA 2K. Keeps the business running smoothly. For many Indonesian gamers, this marked a turning point. Piracy wasn't dead, but it was inconvenient for many, and slowly, buying official games started to feel like a luxury and more like a necessity. On the Xbox side, you won't find modded Xbox One consoles in local game shops. Xbox jailbreaking scene today are reserved for its niche communities, and the Switch arrived late in this generation. By the time jailbreaks became viable, Indonesian gamers were already used to buying original games. Modding Switch units are reserved for its niche communities. Meanwhile, Microsoft disrupted the market with Xbox Game Pass. For a monthly fee, players could access hundreds of games legally. But the real game changer came from digital storefronts. Platforms like Steam and Epic Game Store made official games more accessible. Steam's regional pricing, frequent discounts, and support for local payment methods meant that buying games legally was no longer reserved for the elite. We, as a community, evolved from piracy. For years, it was our way of accessing games we couldn't afford. But as digital storefront became more accessible and regional pricing became more fair, we moved on. We embraced legitimacy. We paid for games, we supported developers, and just when we thought we'd arrive at something sustainable, the polemic began. Live service games started shutting down. Progress lost, purchases void. This growing concern was amplified by the rise of movements like Stop Killing Games in EU. The movement voices shared frustration that digital ownership is fragile and the games we paid for can disappear without warning, without compensation. It's a strange irony. Hey guys, if you're here, congratulations, you've made it to the end of the video. Thank you very much for watching, I really appreciate it. If you want to see more of my content, please do like and share the video, comment out your thoughts to help me improve, and subscribe to my channel. Once again, thank you very much.